This is the eLearning Podcast, episode number 16.
You have a 1 hour conversation every 2 weeks with a partner. In that conversation, we're basically prompting you with the questions to keep it to be positive and action-oriented. So you're continuously driving towards changes that you're making to make yourself more successful. And then you're meeting again 2 weeks later. So you're checking in on that. And we're finding 80% of people who when they make a pledge of an action actually follow through with it.
Wow.
And almost 100% of those lead to higher levels of well-being and fulfillment in their work.
Welcome to the eLearning Podcast from lmspulse.com. My name is Stephen Laddick, and I'm the director at LMS Pulse. My guest for today's episode is Aaron Hurst. A veteran of the social entrepreneurship space, Aaron is an author and researcher in what he calls the science of purpose and fulfillment at work. Aaron is widely known as the founder and CEO of the Taproot Foundation and the author of the book, The Purpose Economy. Today, Aaron has taken the learning from Taproot and the purpose economy and folded it into Imperative, a social learning platform focused on peer coaching. In this very purposeful conversation, Aaron and I talk about Aaron's journey, which was kicked off by a series of personal reflections about meaning and purpose after 9/11. We also talk about the origin of the Taproot Foundation and why some of the things the world most urgently needs is talent and relationships based on knowledge and skill acquisition. We also talk about why technology has made it no longer a privilege to search for your life purpose and create a meaningful career out of it, even if most people find it hard to believe. We also talk about the conflict we face as professionals between advancing our careers for better financial rewards and the impact of our work in our communities and the world. And finally, we talk about why virtually every organizational leader can advance conversations about purpose and social value generation, regardless of the industry or sector you're in. But before we get started, a quick word from our sponsors.
The eLearning Podcast is sponsored by the eLearning Success Summit. Learn from more than 40 experts how to teach, work, and learn online without being overwhelmed. Get your free ticket to the summit at elearningsuccesssummit.com. And lmspulse.com, your best source for news, information, and resources for e-learning professionals for more than 10 years. Get our free roundup of the week's top news at lmspulse.com.
Hello, Aaron. Welcome to the show.
Great to be with you. I'm looking forward to it.
Aaron, I love everything about your background, especially since it's a real background, unlike this. But where do we find you sitting today?
I am in Seattle, Washington, at my house. We moved here about 6 years ago from Brooklyn.
Oh.
My wife took a job as the head of sustainability for Amazon, so it was worth the trip. Although I do miss Brooklyn.
I was just
really
going to say,
heart and soul is.
Yeah, definitely worth the trip. But yeah, I can see you're hanging on with
Oh, I am.
Steel
Absolutely.
grip.
Absolutely. I'm a diehard New Yorker and Yankees fan, and it's been hard not being able to go back over the last 9 months. I usually go back pretty often, but I'm trying to keep it alive, wearing the hat, keeping it real.
Fantastic. We're recording this, at the top of November right here in 2020. I've kind of started every conversation on this podcast like this. How's your COVID been? I mean, you said you haven't been able to go back for 9 months. What's the situation right now, and how are you faring?
I honestly feel pretty like it's a combination of guilt and just feeling gratitude. Been healthy, family's been healthy. I think living in Seattle makes this just so much easier than it would have living in New York, being in a house instead of an apartment. I think my wife's company, Amazon's doing okay in the pandemic. And, our work is really all about helping people connect remotely. So from a work perspective, I mean, we couldn't have asked for a better crisis to be able to help people. And just when you see so much hurt out there, to be able to do something that actually matters and is relevant just feels like such a blessing to be in that position. So overall, there's so many people suffering. So I feel guilty of saying like it's actually been mostly positive. I've gotten in better shape, get more time outside, more time, being able to focus on the family. So it's been more, I think, positive than negative in my own personal life.
That's fantastic. I've had a couple of other conversations. I love the glass half full perspective. That's how we approach it in my family as well. I mean, let's use the opportunity that's given to you, and to hear on one side of the house is sustainability. That's the focus, and on your side of the house, it's purpose. Right. So I mean, you're author of a book called The Purpose Economy. You are the CEO and founder of a company called Imperative. Take us there. So you said that there's been a lot of opportunity here for you to provide a lot of good. What does Imperative do, and why is it important right now?
Yeah, no, love that question. Yeah, and I think my wife is doing it's like environmental sustainability, and we're really doing human sustainability.
Exactly. I mean, and which is,
Which we're not very good at, frankly. Yeah, no, exactly. My journey around this really began about right after 9/11, where we saw there was this incredible demand for people to be doing work that was more relevant, more meaningful. They wanted to be part of the solution, and started an organization called the Taproot Foundation, which was a nonprofit that got marketing, tech, HR, finance professionals to donate their skills on a pro bono basis, like lawyers do, to nonprofits. And we got venture funding as a nonprofit out of the Silicon Valley, and then scaled that around the country, started working at the White House to make it a national campaign, and then worked with BMW to scale that around the world. And it was this incredible journey of helping people find a way to channel their professional skills into the community to do good, and to realize their professional skills weren't just commercial. They were like more universal than that. And what I saw in that work was that the majority of people were doing pro bono work because fundamentally their work itself wasn't fulfilling enough. And there was this incredible quest for purpose that I was seeing in the workplace. And as I looked around more broadly at the economy of consumers, workplace, broader trends and research and science, realized we were going through a major change as a society, that we were starting to go from an information economy into a purpose economy, where the quest for meaning and purpose in our lives was starting to dominate what was creating value and innovation in the overall economy. So, wrote a book, making that case. We're entering a purpose economy, and been on this journey of really trying to figure out how do we help everyone truly bring meaning to their lives? How do they bring meaning to their work? We know that people who don't have meaning at work almost always don't have meaning in their lives. This is not something where you can have a job, you just do your job and go home and have this wonderful, rich, meaningful life. Statistically, that's almost impossible for people working full time, that these things are so intertwined. So we started off doing work around, how do we help people become self-aware about what their purpose is, and built the first ever assessment that actually determined the purpose of every employee in a company, and rolled that out on a global scale. And it was incredibly powerful. But what we saw is just knowing what fulfills you is not enough. You actually have to build it into your mindset and daily routine. And that's really where, we raised venture funding at the start of this year around is this breakthrough we had, which is if we can get people talking to their peers and actually on a regular basis having conversations where they're bringing their best self, their intention, their being thoughtful on a regular basis and making small changes to their job on an ongoing basis. This is what actually not only makes them sort of stronger from a mental health perspective, it makes them more effective, and it actually helps them build the skills that employers are wanting most now, which are really the leadership skills. And what we're seeing right now as we're rolling this out with companies is this is the future we believe of learning and the future of culture. This idea of connecting people for psychologically designed conversations that help them build their skills, that help them grow.
So the first question I have before we dive down the learning path and sort of the model that you've built to roll this out, help people who are listening right now to understand if we're in a purpose economy, how does that translate into financial, financial awareness or financial remuneration, right? If you say people used to start making choices because, hey, way back in the day, here's a 9 to 5 and it's going to pay the bills. And then, information economy, it's built around information. I know if I have a skill set, then I can sell that, or I can, we're creating that more and more. When I'm now moving to wait, I actually have to have purpose. I don't dispute this at all. Everyone that I'm working with, that's a huge component, and especially some of the younger workers that I work with, making very clear choices, sometimes economically detrimental choices, because they're look, it's more important to me to actually feel like I'm doing something right. Let me stop there. Take it there. So how does that translate into helping businesses grow? How does it translate into helping universities grow, learning systems grow, et cetera?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things and I'll give this for a short version. There's a couple of things that are sort of coming together at once, and looking at this from a labor standpoint. One is just you have to look at the progression of the role of work in people's lives and the role of management sort of from the very beginning. And you look at an agrarian economy, and it's basically landowners, and then there were slaves and serfs. And that was sort of the whole dynamic. You move into an industrial economy, and you started seeing people moving to cities, you started seeing factories being created, you started seeing the rise of labor unions. So employees started getting a little more power. They certainly weren't. There was pretty limited power. happening. You then moved into information economy, and you started to see employees are starting to actually get significantly more power because knowledge workers were becoming the primary source of value creation in that economy. So you started seeing a tipping of that power. And then with the purpose economy, we're seeing the full sort of tipping where highly skilled workers, people who are able to create intellectual property value, are able to create, are able to be leaders and sort of expand the work are, I think, frankly, so coveted and in such short supply that they have a lot more power than they ever have. And we sort of basically tipped that whole scale. So then it becomes a question of what do people want, right? So if now I have power, what the hell do you do with that power? And yes, getting paid more is part of that. But a big part of that, which is where the sort of second trend comes in, the last 20 years, there's been so much science and research done around positive psychology, well-being, et cetera. So we now understand as human beings, like that we should expect more and that those are things that are so important. So we're seeing that come into play. And then the third of a sort of simplified look at this is just, we see so much challenge in the world right now. We see so much need out there that, especially ever since 9/11, there's just been this awakening to the fact that we can't just be selfish. Like we need to be thinking of ourselves as serving others and being part of the solution. Wow. So you take those three things together and you just see a fundamental shift in the conversation about work. And that's why, purpose is now mainstreamed. You see with the Business Roundtable, the top CEOs in America have said, you know what, shareholder value is not the only variable here. That is a variable, but we now have to look at our communities, we have to look at our people, we have to look at our supply chain. The world has just gotten more complex and more human, and we can't just sort of continue that old model.
Fantastic. With this visualization, does this make sense to you, or, just kind of dialing it back to that, even the beginning of the industrial society, you kind of have the manager on top and there's the pyramid and it's like the marionette strings, right? And it almost seems like, as you were describing, I just kind of felt that entire thing flip around where as a leader, or a manager now, it's like, hey, how do I provide that balance? And how do I make sure that there's outlets? And does that make sense to you?
No, absolutely. I went from this sort of like work or die control sort of model to like, make me happy as an employee or I'm going to leave and go to your competitor.
Right.
And that is, just think about that. And this is obviously not true of like the whole economy, but it's increasingly so for more and more of it. And that's just changed the way HR technology works. That's changed the way we think about management. Everything is shifting based on that. And then the pandemic just like accelerated the hell out of that, right? Oh, yeah. Because suddenly we started to see like so much more of the mental health needs. We started seeing more and more of sort of the need to support each other. So, you think about a video game, like those old video games where you're like walking and you hit like a speed bump and all of a sudden like you start to like dash forward faster. Like that's what the pandemic did to this movement, is just completely accelerated, I think, leadership's understanding of the need to humanize work and to meet the sort of true needs of human beings.
Fantastic. So take us there. So Imperative, you wrote this book, you started Imperative, and you have now been providing a platform for, this, how do we address some of these needs? And that's specifically a peer-to-peer coaching system. So first take us through that and then give us the understanding why. And you and I, kind of pre-show, we're talking about the way that you teach technical skills is very different than the way you teach human skills. And I'd really love for you to pull that apart, because that's really important for our audience in that, why are human skills so different than technical skills? So I just threw like 4 things on your plate there. Sorry.
I know. What order to do them? It's like juggling it. So I'll start with the last piece, which is just really around how does learning work when it comes to human skills? And most of our learning systems are built on technical skill development and the things we traditionally learned in the classroom, things like how do I do a SQL query, right? They're not around things like how do I actually listen to somebody, right? Which is a very different type of skill. And the models that we have for everything from online learning to classroom is really focused on the technical learning modality, which doesn't work for human skill development. There's a couple of key things. I won't go through all of them, but there's a couple of key things that really differentiate the two. One is that with human skills, most of the knowledge resides already within you. And it's more a question of going in and finding that and sorting it and organizing it and bringing it to the forefront into your work. It's about self-awareness. It's about behavior change, right? Whereas technical skills are about there's some knowledge or skill out there that I need to go out and acquire and integrate into my work, right? That's fundamentally different when the core source of content is not going to come from a website. It's going to come, or a teacher or a mentor. It's going to come from within me, and I need to be able to bring that forward. The second major difference is it's super social. Most human skills you can't build on your own, whereas you can learn SQL queries on your own all day. Learning how to actually like have empathy, to listen, et cetera. These are not things you learn in a closet by yourself. Maybe you can get 1% there, but it's fundamentally social, and they need to be reinforced in the culture. Otherwise, they don't stick. So these are just fundamentally different. And I think one of the things we're seeing is that companies are realizing, especially as human skills are what's now the priority with what the pandemic's revealed, is that all their learning systems to date have not really been working because they continue to push this old model of technical skill learning on this sort of fundamental change of what's needed to do human skill development. The second piece is sort of pulling your questions apart. I think one of the things we have in this country and frankly around the world is a loneliness epidemic. We saw last year, before even the pandemic, 61% of Americans said they were lonely. When you think about that, 61%, and then the pandemic hit, right? And we know working from home, the number one challenge is that people feel socially isolated. And the reason this is so important, especially from a learning standpoint, is that when you're lonely, what it causes is that it causes you to be more anxious, stressed, and depressed, right? You're like, that's, yeah, you're like, so from a learning standpoint, so what, right? Like, that's too bad, but like, why does that matter? But the reality is, and we know this about neuroscience, you can't learn crap.
Yeah.
You can't learn anything.
Right.
You can't adapt. And you actually can't even have empathy. They found that like when you're lonely, your ability to have empathy goes down. Your physical health goes down, your energy goes down, your productivity goes down. Like you're shut down as a human being, increasingly the more lonely you get. And the more lonely you get, the more stressed and anxious you get. It creates this flywheel that's really negative. So that's sort of the like, oh my God, the sky is falling version. But the great thing about that is if you flip it the other way, it becomes like a simple solution to fixing all those issues, which is if we can just restore human connection in the workplace to help people not feel lonely, we can actually get the reverse effect to happen. But it's really important to state like what actually creates that human connection. It's not Zoom happy hours, right? It's not meetings. These things don't do it. Even the old like water cooler or coffee like doesn't truly do it. Like that's not really what we're talking about. Shasta Nelson just put out this great book talking about the 3 things that create real human connection. It's positivity. It's got to be positive. You've got to be able to have vulnerability in the conversation, and it has to be consistent, right? It can't just be one conversation. It's about a consistency of that relationship, right? So what we've built with, the purpose or with Imperative is a platform that does that. It basically facilitates consistent, ongoing, positive, vulnerable conversations between employees. So it enables you as an administrator to match all your employees using our algorithm into these conversations. You have a 1-hour conversation every 2 weeks with a partner. In that conversation, we're basically prompting you with the questions to keep it to be positive and action-oriented. So you're continuously driving towards changes that you're making to make yourself more successful. And then you're meeting again 2 weeks later. So you're checking in on that. And we're finding 80% of people who when they make a pledge of an action actually follow through with it.
Wow.
And almost 100% of those lead to higher levels of well-being and fulfillment in their work. So it's not only addressing how do we teach people human skills for the first time effectively in the workplace, it's actually solving for the loneliness epidemic issue in a really powerful way. It's helping to break down barriers between silos inside a company. It's addressing diversity and inclusion objectives. So we're finding this one solution of just, hey, what if we actually have real human connection in a business for the first time? Could be the sort of silver bullet, if you will. Or in recent days, I like to talk about it as being the vaccine for the loneliness pandemic and the learning challenges in the workplace. This can be the vaccine that if you have this built into your ecosystem, it prevents the anxiety, stress, and depression. It enables sort of all these positive attributes to start to flow. So that was a long answer to your set of questions.
Here's the thing, I am like on this end of the phone, I am trying so hard to not interrupt you because every time you say something, I'm just, not only does it resonate with me, and what we've been talking a lot about on the podcast is, one of my mantras has always been just like, we're human relationships are they're fundamentally messy. Right. They are not.
Absolutely.
And so one question I'd like to follow up with you is how do you come up with a formula that allows people to work through that messiness? Or, especially if I'm I'm just thinking, okay, you've matched me up with a peer in my office or in my school or wherever. Maybe I know this person, maybe I don't, personally. What's your strategy for overcoming that initial awkwardness and that sort of, hey, maybe we're not even culturally connected, or maybe we have completely different political views, right? Like there's a lot of messiness there. And so I'd love for you to unpack that for a second.
Yeah, no, I think we did a lot of work on this. It's been a lot of iteration using a lot of sort of existing neuroscience out there. sort of especially around learning. So there's a couple of things that are really important as we think about what makes that possible. The first is knowing what a true peer is that works in a coaching environment. So it needs to be someone at the same rough hierarchical level as you in the organization, because that helps remove that hierarchical fear that would create psychological safety issues. Secondly, they can't be in your immediate team. They need to be at least like 1 or 2 steps removed. So they're not like in your day-to-day playground. And therefore, like you again, increase psychological safety as a result of that, right? So that's sort of the second piece. And then I think I mentioned earlier, we built this purpose assessment. So we have a profiling technology that enables us to identify the purpose of each employee. And we start each conversation by surfacing aspects of their purpose, aspects of their best self. So when they're asking each other the first questions, it's not like, how crappy was your day to day, or what are your problems? It's like, I see that like you want to make this, like, this is the impact you want to make in the world. Like, tell me about that. When are times you've done that? Like, how would you like to do more of that? And guess what? Like, I'm showing up big when you like talk to me that way. So it brings out the best in people. And throughout every conversation, we just put little drips of this content in there, and it keeps people there. And the final thing I'll share, there was this great research done by Arthur Aronson that the New York Times covered famously a number of years ago about how to get strangers to fall in love. And they basically have this 36 question protocol of back and forth conversation that people have that actually creates that intimacy with a stranger of like what it feels like to fall in love. And we've used a lot of the learning from that to help 2 employees not fall in love in a romantic sense, but fall in love in the sense of feeling like, I see you and you see me. And I trust you. And we have like a level of intimacy there. And it's amazing. We found like employees just immediately like melt, and they trust each other when you're helping them in that kind of environment. And they're able to, like, we consistently hear, like, it was a breakthrough conversation. I haven't had this deep a conversation with someone I didn't like, with someone I know, much less someone I didn't know, in my first 1 hour with them. And it's because we're using these psychological protocols that help people get to that place of safety.
So could you create a visualization for the people listening to the podcast right now, but also maybe the people who are watching this? What does it look like? Does it look like a Zoom conversation, and where, you know, can you kind of have prompts like appearing in bubbles on the side? Like what does the interface actually look like?
No, I love it. So it is video based. We have a video embedded into our platform. So we are talking over video, and it is producing basically the questions of saying, like, ask this question now. Here's the follow-up question to ask. Here's some dynamic content from their profile that you might want to reference in the question. So it's producing all of that. Each conversation has 3 to 4 questions and then an action prompt at the end of like, what are you going to do about it? And have them think through that. And then one of the things that's really proven powerful is that you take notes for your partner. So I ask you a question. I'm now taking notes on what you're saying, which makes you really feel heard, but it also forces me to truly digest. And then when I share back what I've written, it adds additional value for you because my take on it helps you learn about yourself, just in how it's landing with somebody.
Wow.
So that note-taking process for each other also creates this library of content for yourself from all of your conversations that you can go back to when you're looking at, you know, setting goals, when you're wanting to remember the conversation, et cetera. So it's fully embedded. One of the things we hear a lot that people love is that you can come out of a meeting hot, enter into this, and like within 30 seconds, like you're just in a totally different state. You're in this safe place, and you didn't need any training. You didn't need any prep work. Like you can just enter it, and it just puts you in the right mood, in the right place to have a powerful conversation. And you end with this like such a high level of energy because it feels so good to talk about ourselves, to like be vulnerable, to have these kind of positive conversations. It's just amazing, like how transformational that 1 hour is every time people do it.
What have been some of the, you see, this has obviously gone through multiple iterations and whatnot.
Yep.
What are some of the challenges that you're still experiencing with this, and that, you know, points where you see the product and the service adjusting and shifting and still needing to grow? Where are the gaps that still lie in this? And
no, I mean, I think this.
Yeah.
Yep. Go ahead. I think there's gaps.
The thing that I was going to say was, you know, you're matched one-on-one with a peer. Does that then, you know, how long does that conversation last? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it 1 month? And then I move on to somebody else? Or how did, like,
so you basically do 5 conversations in a quarter with a partner, and then you switch every quarter. So at the end of a year, you've got 4 new best friends at work, right? 2 years, you have 8. So it's like building this like network of people you have this incredible relationship with. So that's just been really a big part of it, especially when you think about it from like an inclusion standpoint of having you find 4 people that you wouldn't otherwise build connections with. They may come from different backgrounds, et cetera. And like getting beyond the superficial, the way they look, their background, to actually like seeing them as human beings. Like there's nothing else in the market that helps people see each other as human beings in the workplace. Like we've really cracked the code on that. And I think it's super scalable. So to your question, so there's things that we're just looking to get better and better at, right? So every time we match people and then we see how it goes, we're learning things that help us do better and better matching. So I think we do a good job of that. We'll do a better and better job of that, over time. Being able to dynamically insert the right questions is something that, again, like every month we're going to get better at, because we're seeing the live data as thousands of people are having these conversations to help make them more and more targeted towards folks. And part of that too is integrating corporate content. So we have a lot of partners who say, look, we've got these 5 leadership principles. We want to embed those in the conversation. So we can embed those into the conversation. But increasingly, the conversations are going to be dynamically generated based on who the company is and who the person is, so that it's really just like reinforcing and feeling so much like exactly the conversation that you want to be having with those folks. And then on the corporate side, our vision is that we're collecting all this incredible data, and we have to make sure that we never betray the trust of people doing the conversations. But there are a lot of ways to anonymously look at trends in the notes, in the data, to help bring insights that you would never get through like an engagement survey for a company. So we really see a significant, opportunity to produce value with the data for companies as well.
That was definitely my next question, was like the back end of this. If I'm, let's just say, you're connecting all your line managers or, your frontline workers, or even, your top level management. Like if I'm looking at this from how am I making my company, my institution, my organization better? What does that data look like that comes out of it? It's that, hey, is it sentiment data? Is it,
it's less sentiment, because you're actually taking.
So like help me understand, like as a leader, if I'm looking at a dashboard of sort of all of these conversations that we've facilitated, like what am I potentially able to look at and say, wow, we need to maybe make some tweaks here or there?
I think it's a mix of things, right? So it's less sentiment because someone's actually taking notes for you. So it's not getting your direct language that way. What you're seeing are themes. Like, what are people talking about? What are the challenges they're talking about? What are they seeing as opportunities? It also, like, if you start looking at, for example, those leadership principles, if we're asking people, like, if your leadership principle is integrity, we'll just pick the most generic one possible. And you're asking people like, well, what does integrity mean to you, right? Well, they're writing that, and you can start to see like how people are actually defining those terms, and their examples of how those are showing up in their work on like not just 10 people, but like tens of thousands of people defining integrity for you. So you can start looking at topics like that. Or let's say you're going through a major change as a company, right? And you want your employees to talk about like, how's that change going for you? We can capture like the themes that are coming out of that, the areas where you may need to do more, et cetera. So those are some of the areas where we think it can really bring insight that's beyond just sort of that emotional sentiment piece, but actually be thematic and also just definitional to feed into your strategy as a company. Fantastic.
One of the things that's just kind of been lingering in the back of my mind is your partnering process. I mean, you and I right now, I said, everybody, we're at the top of November right here. We have a polarized world, right? There's some polarization going on, especially.
Someone told me that. I didn't know
that. Where does that, or does that come into play in the algorithm of matching? Does that come in? And when do you, like, I could see difficult conversations happening within these peer conversations. And is that just part of the discovery process? Is that part of something that you coach people through the interface? Or, when we find people who just like, look, I have a fundamental different view on this than you do, or let me leave it there. How does that work?
It's a couple different pieces to it. I think one, we see ourselves as the anti-Facebook in a way. Facebook's about polarized sort of information, putting people into like the fear-based model, and it's around sort of disinformation in a lot of cases. We're putting people into an environment of like respect for people as human beings, and where you dig deeper than the superficial. Most of the disagreements at the superficial level, once you get deeper, like a lot of that goes away. Or if you disagree at that level, you at least respect because you understand the why and the story behind it. And it's hard to vilify somebody when you see them as a human being, right? And we've seen that, whether it's war, whatever it is, like when you can
crystallization of the enemy that's the number one, that's how you start a conflict and how you sustain it.
That's exactly right. And this like makes it almost impossible to do that, right? Because you're actually building like that kind of connection. What we've seen is that, I look at some of the notes and like just to sort of understand what people are talking about. So, Target's one of our clients. When George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, sort of where Target is based, we didn't have questions about Black Lives Matter, but just people brought it up in the conversations, and you just saw they were supporting each other and exploring it and creating a safe place to be like, I don't know what I feel or how I approach this or how I can make a difference. And they were supporting each other in that exploration. I saw a comment the other day in one of them that just came through sort of my feed that was someone saying, you know what, I really don't understand the other point of view on abortion. And like my goal this week is to find someone who just has a very different perspective on it and like try to really hear them and listen to them. I was like, that's awesome, like, right? Yeah. That's so like, that's exactly what we want. But I think these conversations are inspiring that thought of like, I wonder if I had this kind of conversation that I'm having on peer coaching with someone who's red or blue or whatever this, you know, political spectrum is, like, could I help understand them better? And this is sort of one of my fantasies, is that we could take all the like, you know, Democrats, Republicans, and like match them as peers across the whole country for a series of peer coaching conversations about like, what does it mean to be American and why, what does that mean to you? And like, why does that matter? What do you care about? And I think we would find that like 95% alignment on everything that matters. Everything else is just stuff that, you know, whether it's from Facebook or then sort of polarized news cycles or just being able to treat people as like masses is pulling us apart. Because I really fundamentally believe if we can get people to connect as human beings, like, there's no real problem there.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Does this work across cultures? You know, we you and I, again, I'm from Colorado, you're from Brooklyn. We're talking a lot about the States, and it seems to, you know, we've got our low context culture, you know, we're fundamentally similar in that way. My family lived in Thailand for the last 4 years. You know, collective culture, you don't talk about stuff, you know, you keep everything in the background. You know, I'm thinking about Asian cultures. Do you think that this process translates into, you know, those different types of cultures, or have you tested that at all?
I mean, I think we've done limited testing on that. I think I would start with the assumption like we're all human beings, right? And then there's sort of the cultural piece of like comfort around that. We've designed it all so that you can go as deep or as shallow as you want to go in answering questions. So it doesn't force people to go any deeper than they're comfortable with, which we're finding makes a big difference just to enable that level of sort of personal dialing of safety. We have yet to see any real issue there in the populations we've worked with. There hasn't been a meaningful variation. And, you know, we've also looked at it not just in terms of like, you know, people who are Thai versus, you know, American. We've looked at it like marketers and salespeople versus engineers.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like those are two pretty different cultures in theory as well. And some of our best early, you know, client work has been with engineering groups, people who, you know, stereotypically are not super psyched to talk about emotion.
Sure, yeah, they're not going to be having the parties and those kinds of things.
It's blowing away the stereotypes though. These people, like, they start doing it and they love it, and they're like, this is so great to be able to like have these conversations. I never would have had this kind of conversation. I would have been comfortable to, but you've made it so like I'm, you know, comfortable or increasingly comfortable like opening up and having that kind of dialogue, right? So I think I don't think we're 100% there yet. We're gonna have to continuously dial that. And, you know, when we've scaled and we've got 1 million conversations a day going on the platform, I mean, there will be algorithms in there knowing, you know, cultural backgrounds, et cetera, to like modify for that. But I would say it's like super promising that like, I like to talk about not as the lowest common denominator, but the highest common denominator is that we're human beings. I think this raises to the highest common denominator because it respects people. And when you respect people, it can overcome, I think, an awful lot of the things that would normally be those barriers.
I love that. And you don't even have to call it the denominator, right? Ultimately, it's the multiple, you know,
it's a multiplier.
our most common multiple, right? Or high.
Yeah.
Just think of it in a different way. Aaron Hurst, you wrote a book called The Purpose Economy, and you are the CEO and founder of a company called Imperative, which is an incredibly interesting peer, you know, coaching model for bringing together relationships and the loneliness epidemic and whatnot. Last question I have for everybody on this podcast is, what are you excited about 6 months from now, 12 months from now, you see coming down the pipe? Is it a shiny new object? Is it, you know, the continued scaling of Imperative? Is there something outside your universe that you're like, I really can't wait to see how this plays out, that you'd like to share with everyone?
I mean, it's profound for me, but it's probably not super interesting to listeners. But I literally get like a goosebumps or like a little bit of like tearing up every time I see like a conversation's completed in the database. And just think about like that hour, these two people had that conversation. I'm like, that we just made that happen. Those people would not have talked. And you sort of think about that, you know, and by the end of this year, we'll have done about 10,000 conversations. The biggest thing I'm excited about for next year is like, how do we sort of scale this up so that we're getting to, you know, hundreds of thousands of conversations? How do we get to the point like in the next 6 months to 12 months where like, just there's that many goosebumps that are being created, that many connections that are happening. And then we're going to start seeing like all kinds of just unexpected positive consequences as a result of it. So I feel like we've landed on the thing that can transform work and society. And to me, it's all now about just like, how do we get as many people as possible doing this work Because if we can get there, and I put it in like a 4-year cycle of the presidential elections in the US, like if we can get millions of people to do this by the next election, like I think it will affect the election. Like I think this has that kind of impact. We've just got to stop demonizing people and start humanizing them. And I think we figured out how to do that.
Thank you so much for the conversation today. Absolutely fantastic. And I wish you all the luck.
Right back at you.
Thanks again for tuning into today's episode of the eLearning Podcast. If you like what you've learned today in this episode, I encourage you to either follow us or subscribe to us on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. And please do share this episode with 1 or 2 of your colleagues or friends. Also, I just want to remind you that you can level up your online learning game with all of the information that's available at the eLearning Success Summit. You can get your free ticket at elearningsuccesssummit.com. And finally, you can also stay up to date on everything that's important, all the news and the resources for e-learning professionals at lmspulse.com. Get our free newsletter by just going to lmspulse.com today. Thanks again.